I was thinking.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you would give your undivided attention, I will give you an abbreviated Friday. How's that?
Yes.
You've got to give your undivided attention first. It's not undivided yet, so Caleb's gonna root it for everybody.
Like always.
Okay, we'll start back with that map of Europe in 1916. That's the countries of Europe. This is how the alliance is shaped up. It's the green against the brown. That's the Triple Alliance, which we're going to start calling the Central Powers. The green is the Triple Entente, which we're going to start calling the Allies. Everybody got that? Capital A. There's an alliance with a small a, which just means an agreement between countries. There's a capital A, Allies. That means that's the specific group known as the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. And then later, of course, you know the spoiler alert that the U.S. is going to eventually join this war on the side of the capital A, Allies. So, you know, we use the word allies like Austria, Hungary, and Germany. That's with a small a. When we use the word allies, referring to Russia, Great Britain, and France, we're talking about capital A. I always mess that up. I've done that how many times and I still can't get the order of the lights to have the Okay, American neutrality. Yesterday, I think we got through most of this. You understand what's going on here? America does not want to get involved in a war 3,000 miles away. Why should we? Well, in our lifetimes, mine and yours, America has been involved in wars more than 3,000 miles away. And in your lifetime, just this year, as you're becoming a young adult, you realize that America was involved in a war overseas more than 3,000 miles away for 20 years, right? Since before you were born until last month or 2 months ago, America was involved in this quote unquote war, right? Now, it was a worldwide war on terror, but a lot of the center, the focus of it was in the Middle East, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan, we just left 2 months ago, right? Follow all that? Why were we involved in that? Oh no. Some people would be very cynical and they'd say, we're losing all of these soldiers and it's just for oil. Okay, well, if we analyze that, we say it's just for oil. And oil is kind of like the engine that runs the United States economy. If you think about all the uses we have for oil, from your car to airplanes to all the factories that are run, how do we function without oil? And if oil is too expensive, what would that do to our economy? So when people say to you, because they say it very cynically and they say it to appeal to your base emotion of, oh, people are dying for oil. And they say it with such passion and they teach it in such a way that would be awful. You have to think in real terms, like what would that mean for America? Why have wars always been fought throughout history? It's always about economics. True, you will be taught that the Civil War was not fought about slavery. It was fought about the economics of slavery. True. Isn't that even true? Right? The Civil War was fought. Yeah, slavery was a big part of it. So I don't teach this Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was. So I don't get involved in that silly argument. Like, again, it's kind of like are we a republic or a democracy? I think it's silly. Just, you don't have to be everything that's not black and white. Was the Civil War fought over slavery? Of course it was. Was the Civil War fought over economics? Of course it was. It's both at the same time, right? So is it immoral to fight wars over economic issues? Well, then there would never be war. Does that make sense? So of course you could be high and mighty and moral and say, oh, we should never be involved in wars for money or oil, which translates to money. Okay, yeah, you're right. There should never be war. So should America get involved in this war 3,000 miles away? How does it affect us? Unless it's economic. And if it affects us economically, does that matter? Should it matter? You understand what I'm saying in my opening monologue here? Should economics matter when it comes to putting people's lives in danger in war? We could stand on our moral soapbox and say no, because of course not. It's not worth lives for money. Well, yeah, on the surface, anybody could say that and feel very virtuous about saying that, because who would believe that that's a good thing? But that's not reality. Reality is, for 6,000 years, wars have been fought about money. That's it. That's what it is. It's unfortunate, but that's real life. So the argument is we shouldn't get involved 3,000 miles away. For our physical security, you're absolutely right. Why would we? No one's threatening us. They're not threatening to come over here and bomb the United States, so we should stay out of it. Most Americans agree. We should not get involved in that war. Even people that were like, they're not against war, they were like, I don't think it's worth us going over there. And they're getting reports coming back home from the front, and they're seeing pictures of the battlefields. Like, I don't know if I want my kid going over there to fight in Europe. How's that affecting us? Until they would realize that it would really start affecting them economically, then they might change their minds. Does that make sense? All that. So, are we going to be able to stay neutral? Well, you might think that if on May 7th, 1915, knowing a little bit what you know about America, and I know you're only 15, 16 years old, and you're like, you don't know everything that has happened, or you might not have a total grasp on American culture, but I think you might know things like on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, guess what? On December 8th, 1941, America was ready to go to war. I know a guy personally, he's in his mid to upper 90s now, that when he was 16, he quit school, went to the recruiter's office, lied to them, told him he was 18. This happened with a lot of people. Told him he was 18. Of course, there was no digital records like they have today, right? You could easily get away with lying back then, forging documents. And so he ran to the recruiter's office. He couldn't wait after December 7th to go fight for America in World War II. So you would think after this happened, a generation before that would be like, man, Americans were, they were probably all for the war now. No. Especially our president. Our president was, again, remember the idealism, the idea that you can bring peace to the world just through the shining example. America's got to be that example that says we don't have to use force or war to affect the world in a good way. We are the shining light. So he's doing everything he can to keep us out of war. Even when they torpedo a passenger ship, it's a passenger ship. Germany says, oh, no. You might say it's a passenger ship. You're sending supplies to the Allies, to your allies. You're supposedly not involved, but you're sending supplies to Great Britain. We know you are. You're calling it a passenger ship. So they gave warnings. They said it's a war zone, right? I think that was before. That all the waters around Great Britain are now considered a war zone. If you send your ship in there, you're at risk. Well, they torpedo a ship. Almost 1,200 people sink. See, you all heard of the Titanic, but maybe you never heard of the Lusitania. 128 of those were Americans. Imagine that happening today, Annie. Wouldn't it be all over the news today that America would be like, oh, we better go get them? Am I right? Is she talking about what food could torpedo is a food? I'm trying to think what you could possibly be confusing that with.
Yeah, I know what she's talking about, but they're not
Like chicken
torpedoes.
wraps, they're not torpedoes.
Molly?
Torpedo.
I don't know, I just
Just like torpedo and torpedo.
I'm sorry, that threw me for a loop. I
have those at my.
things that you can't imagine. Like when you're teaching, you kind of think about what questions the students might ask. That would never cross my mind.
Well, if someone says like, hey, do you want to eat this torpedo?
What?
Is there such a thing?
No.
Is that like is it Sonic or something? Is that like one of those fast food places I never,
I know what she's talking about, but it's not torpedo.
you said it's like a chicken wrap?
They're like,
Probably.
Okay, anyway, back to US history, and this ship that gets sunk, and we still, America is not for war.
Mr. Franken, taquitos, or whatever.
Oh, my.
Oh, torpedo, taquito, I get it.
Yeah, it's like this.
The captain and crew of the Lusitania dismissed fears of submarines and encouraged passengers to enjoy the elegant amenities on board the 787-foot luxury liner. Vacationing couples on the lower decks enjoyed shuffleboard, while the wealthy travelers in first class were served high tea in the Veranda Cafe. From intercepted communications, the British knew the German submarine U-20 was lurking in the path of the Lusitania. Yet they chose not to send destroyers out to meet the ship and escort it into Liverpool.
Germany has warned the world that these waters are considered a war zone. If you send your ship into these waters, their ship's at risk. This is a passenger ship, so passengers are like, we're not gonna bomb them. This isn't like a ship carrying a bunch of supplies to England, so they would never do that, right? And you notice what he just said, the English, knowing, because they're intercepting messages in German, knowing what the Germans are intending, knowing that the submarines actually in the area don't even choose to go escort the Lusitania into port. Now, why do you think that might happen? Yeah.
Because then it really might be considered like a smuggled
Oh,
ship.
Sydney says if the Brits did that, they would be indicating to Germany that, hey, this is a ship that we have to keep safe. That's a good point. Yes.
Because they wanted it to get bombed.
On the other side of that, Sydney, is the idea that maybe England wanted the ship to get, oh, that's pretty cynical. There's a ship with 1,200 people on it, and Isaac's insinuating that England would have wanted that to happen. Why do you think England would have wanted that to happen?
Wasn't that America angry at Germany?
Do you think if you're in the middle of this quote unquote world war that's enveloped all of Europe, do you think at this time in history that you might want America on your side? Yeah. That's pretty cynical though, isn't it? To think that a country would sacrifice all of that. I like Sydney's idea better, that they would be alerting the Germans that, oh, this is a ship that we want to make sure you don't mess with. Can you see both sides? Like both sides could have a point, huh? In this video, the man that's going to talk next, kind of cynical like Isaac. Not that Isaac was just proposing that. He's not saying that that's actually how he thinks, right?
No.
Within the halls of the British Admiralty, some argued that if the Lusitania was lost, it might precipitate American entry into the war.
The British are definitely trying to get America involved in this war. Right from the beginning, there is a sense of, we need you here. Your shipping is not going to be enough. We are your brethren. You must support us.
On Friday, May 7th, as passengers excitedly scanned the horizon for their first sight of land, the torpedo hit the ship's side. The explosion ripped a huge gash in the Lusitania. It took only 18 minutes for the Leviathan to slide beneath the waves. For months after the Lusitania went down, dead bodies washed ashore. Hundreds of others were pulled lifeless from the Irish Sea, the corpses stacked on the docks. Many of the casualties could not be identified and were buried in mass graves. In all, 1,198 men, women, and children were lost. 128 of them were Americans. The New York Sun called the sinking premeditated and dastardly, and the Herald denounced it as wholesale murder on the high seas.
What the Lusitania did was to bring the war home to Americans. Up to that time, it was this awful thing was happening to other people far away. Now, the war had reached out and touched us. But what it did really was, I think, redouble an awful lot of people's determination to stay out of it. The American media had been covering the war for months and months now. We knew what it was like. Americans had been imagining their sons at the battlefront. We don't want to buy into that. And here's this act of barbarism that's threatening to bring us in.
Much of America is now beginning to discuss what should America's role be in this war now that we are losing lives. How do we maintain a position of neutrality?
Who's that? Identify that man. Woodrow Wilson. It's his, remember, he came into office all idealistic. He had this plan as a great administrator. He's going to run America. He didn't really have any foreign affairs experience. And now, have you ever heard about or thought to yourself, when you see pictures of presidents, how much they age in a 4-year span? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Like if you see a picture of a president when they enter office and when they leave office 4 years later, there's usually a very marked sign of how much they aged in that 4 years. Much more than like Mr. Franklin. Right? You know, you go back 5 years to 5th grade and 4 years old. Wow, Mr. Franklin, you haven't changed much at all in those 4 years. But something about being a president makes you age pretty quickly. It shows on your face, right? So Woodrow Wilson, I'm sure, went into office with all these idealistic ideas and now didn't have much experience in foreign affairs, and that's basically what his presidency is defined by. He kept us out of war, which he did. He tried to do and almost pulled it off. Comments, questions? Okay. I said we're going to be done quick, so just a little bit more. And we'll bring this week to a close. We'll just talk about, we are going to jump ahead a year and a half, amazingly. And you're going to get a handout, a couple handouts between today and Monday, because we're teaching World War I from a United States perspective. So most of what we talk about is going to be like, okay, what was the United States involvement in this war and all the things, you know, like the economics of it. If you were learning this in world history, then you would get a much broader learning about it, right? So since the notes are mainly about U.S. involvement, I have a couple handouts, one today, you'll get one Monday, that kind of add to it so that you don't leave a study of World War I without knowing like the basics of it outside of the United States. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? So it's going to be, you're going to have notes and these worksheets for the test. And the test isn't for a while yet, so don't worry about that. All right. So we go a year and a half. A year and a half is a long way to go in the middle of a war. A lot could happen. Strangely, in World War I, there really wasn't a whole lot that happened. Of course, there's battles going on. But remember what kind of warfare this was? Trench warfare. And what does that mean? That means that they were in their trenches almost all the time. Nobody wanted to go out into the middle of no man's land, because when that happened, usually it didn't go well, even for the ones that were doing the attack. So we get to 1916 election. So we're going through the summer of 1916. 1915, World War I is known for two words, trench warfare and deadlock. Neither side was winning, especially on the Western Front is where the trench warfare took place. And the Allies, what we consider the good guys, and the Central Powers, neither one could make much, like, and most of the war in 1915 into 1916, every once in a while, one side might advance like 2 miles or something. That's literally how slow the pace was as they were in those trenches. So he kept us out of war, and he did, even after the sinking of Lusitania. This is almost a year and a half after that sinking, and America's still having the conversation, and there's still a debate, like, should we get involved in this? What if the Germans do another thing, which, by the way, they did? Oh, by the way, Wilson's going to have the support of most of the people in the West. You know why? This is going to sound strange. But if you're in the Western United States, the war's even further away from you. Like literally, the thinking is this war is like 3,000 miles away if you're living in New York. If you're living in LA, it's not like almost on the other side of the world. Like, well, why would you say you see what I'm saying? Even though you're all Americans, it's like psychologically, it's something that's even further away. And also in the West, they're not as industrialized. So they're not as involved in the economics of trade, the trade that we're doing with them, because most of our industry is still in the Northeast. So those Western states weren't known for supporting the war. What do we call a group of people that are for war? It's named after a bird. They're called war hawks. War hawks, they call them, because, and it's meant to be kind of a derogatory term, that if you support war, you're a war hawk, and you don't want to be called a war hawk. Well, here's the thing. For future reference, like I was just talking about in the opening of the class, it's so easy to say that you're against war. Who isn't? You listening to me? Who isn't against war? I'd like to meet the person. And by the way, I could be talking about General Patton. If you don't know who that is from World War II, do a little study on him. I mean, you talk about a guy that God's on your side. He would tell you the same thing. Who wants war? People act like they're virtuous because I'm against the war. What? Who isn't against war? Again, 6,000 years. Let's see. What's the Bible say? All the war, war is part of life. It's unfortunate. It's sick. We hate it. It's evil. It's HE double hockey sticks. No one's for war, but there are times when you can't do anything but fight or be slaughtered, literally sometimes, right? You got hyphenated Americans. Who are they? Who are hyphenated Americans? Well, in the world you're growing up in, you've heard of like African Americans, right? Like African hyphen American. Well, if you're from Germany, you might call yourself a German American, or if you're from Ireland, you call yourself an Irish American or an Italian American. That's what it means by hyphenated Americans. So why is that in the notes? What does that mean? That means that most people that were more recent immigrants, what did we say yesterday? They were from Germany or Ireland, right? A lot of them were from those places. So they still had that kind of tag that, hey, I'm a first generation migrant. I'm a German living in America. First generation, meaning like, hey, I'm still speaking German, like at my home. So I'm a German American. The hope is, in this thing we call melting pot in America, that all the hyphens would go away and we'd all just be Americans. Make sense? But it's kind of makes sense to when you're first generation that you're German American. Those people were more likely to support Wilson because, what's his campaign slogan? He kept us out of war. He's the Democrat. There's that man again. William Jennings Bryan. This might be the end. Might be the last time you hear William Jennings Bryan because he resigns. Do you remember what his role was? What was his position? What did Wilson make him?
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State. One that has to deal with all these foreign issues. And now I said I was going to be abbreviated today, didn't Get this, this is kind of weird, that's why I put a question mark behind it. He resigned because he thought Wilson was being too strong. When they sank the Lusitania, Wilson did not declare war on Germany, but he made a very strong statement. You would hope the American president, after 128 innocent passengers on a ship, got drowned in the ocean after getting blown off the ship, you would hope the American president would at least have some strong words for Germany, wouldn't you? Well, William Jennings Bryan thought that his words were too strong, it might provoke Germany, so he resigned. So I just put that in there because you've been hearing about him so much. Americans killed. Another ship gets sunk by Germany. This time it's a French passenger ship, and not 128, but I think it's like a dozen or so Americans get killed on this ship. Guess what? We still don't declare war on Germany. But Wilson gives them a stern warning. You do that again, the Republicans have a candidate that you never heard of, and why would you? He wasn't Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was on the Supreme Court. And when 1916 came, he said, you know what, we need to beat this Wilson guy. We cannot continue down this road of, not picking a side in this war. So he decides to run for president, and the Republican candidate, Hughes, is going to get all the people that are like, you know what, it's not good, but we got to do it. And these people are going to be from what part of the country do you think? The East, the Northeast. Why? Industry. Why? Because they sell their products. Where? In America and abroad. They export their products. There's trade going on with all of these countries in Europe. Oh, how does that affect us? Well, if the company that you work for, if the factory that you work in, all of a sudden their trade comes to a halt, they can't produce any more products because they have nowhere to sell them. Guess who's out of a job? You are. If you invest in these companies and these companies start making less money, guess whose investments go down the drain? Yours. Economics aren't a reason to go to war? Hello? Do you have to be a war hawk to finally say yes, that it's okay to sometimes you have to fight? This is what the map looks like. This is the last thing. This is what the map looks like in 1916. And before I put it up there, I'm going to see who's the first to observe something. If you're observant, when I put this map up there, okay, put your observation eyes on, your analytic eyes on, and notice that it was a pretty tight election, right? 277 to 254. Wilson wins. He's the blue states. Hughes is the red states. Oh, by the way, notice it's not Eugene V. Debs anymore. You still got that random socialist out there getting 500,000 votes. Okay, see who's really observant. 277 to 254. Somebody raise their hand when they think they know what I'm talking about. How did Wilson win the election? Some could say you could boil it down to one thing. Well, go ahead.
Because you won Ohio.
Ohio, look. The Republican candidate has all of this support all the way through the northern United States and the Northeast. Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois. Ohio went to Wilson. If you take those 24 from Wilson and give them to Hughes, Woodrow Wilson doesn't win the election. Does that make sense? Have you heard, because you were teenagers in the last election just a year ago, how important Ohio is in all presidential elections? Have you heard what an anomaly it was? Why people were so, have you heard why all the strife about the election still a year later, people are still talking about it? Like, how did this possibly happen? Because rarely does a candidate ever win Ohio, especially by as much as Trump did, and not win the election. That doesn't make sense. Because Ohio is like always a major factor. 100 years ago, Ohio was a major factor in who wins the presidency. That was the tipping point. You know, look, it's especially true because, look, all of this, all of the South, Wilson wins. He wins all these states. And the Republicans winning all of those states except Ohio. And that was the key. Make sense? Okay, I got these, you don't have to fill these out. These aren't really due till Tuesday. We'll go over them Tuesday. So you can put them in your folder / handy dandy notebook right now. But they're just in addition to the notes. We'll go over and highlight anything you got to know for the test before that. Test is at least 2 weeks from now.
Take that back.
Okay. I know I skipped that. And I think I gave you over there.
Get higher.
Little Goblin Junior. What is going on?
I'm so excited to get this Spider-Man. I'm so excited to wear it.
Should I get Tobey Maguire's original suit or the Bully Maguire suit?
Anyway.
You'll probably regret it either way. It's just one of those ones. But get Bully Maguire.
Why not?
What in doubt?
It looks good, it just takes the mask.
Is there a Toby one with a better mask?
Well, the trailer was so mid.
You watched it?
I heard Tobey Maguire wasn't in it, so I didn't watch it.
I'm so happy he was.
Andrew Garfield is such a good looking guy. He's so good.
No, do you comment that you agree? Do you comment on Andrew? Harry.
Yes.
Well, we did touch on that.
Harry's the most chaperone. You know,
Harry's in legal trouble.
Imagine if Toby's Harry was Andrew's Spider-Man.
Oh, I'm sorry, dude.
He's just been gone, man.
I would hate that actually.
No, that would be terrible. We'd be such an attractive duo.
I like throwing things over
I'd
the
probably like,
So-
have enough to hold it.
And you have to stand. Oh my God.
Every time we see a Harry, I'm like,
I'm just like, I got time to cross my legs.
But I would think it was like.
What is your one?
Mr. Brady, we get papers? You literally told Trey you knew that you skipped him, and then you just kind of forgot about it.
There's no extras over there?
do it every time.
I just
Yeah.
I'm cracking her.
Watch the end of the video. That's,
Exactly.
a big elephant.
Okay, the question is, it's Annie's question day.
Go Annie.
This is a question I can maybe explain better than the torpedo. Annie wants to know why, when they talk about the empire, like say the British Empire or and it says that, like, what's the question say? What's it say again? Something about,
Germany wanted to build her.
okay, Germany wanted to build her empire. She wants to know why the pronoun her is in there when they talk about building the empire. Empire. Anybody got an answer to that? Does anybody know? Do you consider it a bad thing or good thing or neutral? Like nothing, it's just like you don't know. Like are you wondering why they didn't say his empire?
I was just wondering.
Right, because there's a choice there, isn't there?
Yes.
Do we say Germany built his empire or her empire?
What's empire?
Yeah.
It's like one of those things you say.
Empire.
Like one of those things you're talking about.
Yeah, Barnes and
My take on
Noble.
Andy, answer your question. And I'm not saying
I like reading.
empire
Yeah,
is
Barnes and Noble.
like more of a.
I don't find that shit out. I would say
So the mother maybe should be like. That makes sense? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Maybe.
Mr. Brackett, isn't Germany the fatherland though?
I guess. I'm looking over.